Hello, everyone. My name is Harold Pollard, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of South Carolina and part of the iWERS team where I annotate images for the ATLANTIS dataset. In this video, I would like to walk you through how to use CVAT for image annotation. To do so, I have selected a particular image from the ATLANTIS dataset for this purpose. Let's get started. So first things first, you're going to notice with this particular image, it has a black boundary. Most images within this dataset do not have this, so we're going to have to take particular caution when it comes to this black outside boundary, which we don't want to include in our annotation. So to start off, we go over to the left-hand side of CVAT, where we have a bunch of tools. The primary one that we're going to be using today is this polygon right here. With the polygon, we can select a label and then define extents for the label itself. The first label that we'll select is sky. I like to work from the back of an image to the front of an image, so it only makes sense to start with sky. I zoom in on the area where I'd like to start my annotation, click, and then draw the extents of sky. As this label will be covered later by other labels, I'm not concerned with its lower boundary that's going to be covered. I simply click around a bunch, click in to close the label, and then afterwards I hit minus, which sends the label of the particular polygon to the back of our layers. After this, I look at the labels that I have available to me. The next object that sits above the sky doesn't fulfill any of these labels such as fire hydrant, parking meter. It's going to be either vegetation or terrain. In this case, I select terrain for the lack of visible vegetation on the surface, click shape, and then I zoom into an area where I want to start. In this particular top left corner of the image, there's this large dark spot. We can't really make out anything. We see a bounding line at the bottom where it appears our water body begins. So after starting our label, we draw a line down towards the water body, and we define the extents of our polygon there. This top left corner, we can't make out anything. So we choose not to include it within our annotation. Now, quickly zooming around by scrolling with my mouse and dragging as well, I press down on the central key of my mouse and pull to drag around. I then define the extents of my terrain. In this particular image, because of the black bounding box, I cannot click outside to define the extents of my terrain to select every single pixel available in the image, but rather have to be very, very careful and avoid selecting this black bounding exterior. Through this very linear portion of the terrain where it's very flat, I simply click and drag. However, when I approach this portion of terrain that's a little less linear and more curved, at this point, I'd like to bring up a nice tool that we have with CVAT. So when defining borders for polygons, we can either click individually and create nodes in that way, or what we could do is to hold down Shift and drag our mouse in the direction that we'd like to annotate. I'll demonstrate this now by holding Shift and dragging. This creates many more nodes than if we were to just click, unless we were to click wildly, and then we could reach the same number of nodes. But by shifting and moving in the direction with our mouse, which we are interested, we can create a very detailed outline. However, we all make mistakes when annotating, and as a result, sometimes we draw where we don't want to. To fix this mistake, I simply right-click with my mouse, which deletes the previous node that I added. I do this back to the point where I'd like to start again, and then continue annotating from there. Once I'm satisfied with the polygon, I hit N to close again, and at this point, I'll click on the polygon and hit plus. This brings the polygon to the very front, which is crucial to make sure that our polygons are ordered correctly and layered on top of each other correctly as I continue to annotate. This becomes especially important in particular images with very many polygons. Our more complex images, like I will be able to show you after I work through this image. So next we notice that the label of our interest is this large body of water sitting on the other side of the dam. This is a reservoir. So I go over to polygons, type in reservoir, hit shape to select it, zoom in and pick from my best judgment where the polygon or the reservoir itself begins, and then outline the reservoir. Because this body of water is quite linear, I don't have to worry about holding shift and dragging. Rather, I can simply drag the image around and define the extents by clicking for individual nodes. Once I'm satisfied with the top border of the water body, I drag along the side, and at this point, I've reached another label. This will be dam. To avoid confusion with layer boundaries, I cut in on the dam, and as I've already come to the conclusion that these little pieces of water seen through the dam will be easier to create as individual labels than working around them with the dam, at this point, I simply drag across and close this water body, hitting in, then hitting plus. I'll explain why I made that decision later. Now, I look on the other side of the dam and notice there's a pier. So this will be my next label. I type in pier, select it, then I define the extents of the pier itself. Hitting plus, I now look at the individual lights along the pier. I'll only be annotating a couple of these, as smaller objects like these lights are more difficult and time-consuming than you would initially assume, as a result of each individual node, its placement being very important. At this point, I select pole for our lights due to the shape of the lights and them being supported by poles. I zoom in and drag to define the extents of the poles. Click and close. And at this point, I should mention that if you have multiple labels, after you finish one label, to start up with the same label itself or another polygon, you simply, after closing with N, press N again. This is what I did to create this second pole here. So continuing again with pole. Once I've created a pole, hit N to close. I hit N to start again and can define another pole now. See? Pole. Something else that should be mentioned is that when you have objects like poles or objects that sit at a distance from the camera and you can only see their fuzzy exteriors, it really is your best judgment what you choose to define as the final exterior or the boundary for that polygon. In this case, I tried to encircle the entire fuzzy boundary that's visible just because I don't want that being labeled as pier or as the water body itself, which is the focus of our data set. Go back on the poles, click plus to bring them to the front. And at this point, I arrive at the dam itself. Selecting dam and hitting shape, I go over to the left-hand side of this dam and start defining its boundaries. At this point, I notice kind of a difficult border between the dam and the pier itself. In this case, I simply observe the lighting of the dam. It appears much brighter than the pier, and defining the boundaries for the dam. I also observe features that are present along the rest of the dam, This particular area right here might be confused for the pier, but looking further along the dam, I see the same repeated shape. Thus, I label it as a part of the dam. As I define the extents of the dam, because of how linear the dam is as an unnatural object, man-made, I'm mostly just clicking to create my nodes. For more complex, organic shapes seen in nature, such as the terrain for the background, or much more complex shapes, such as vegetation, seen on trees that are much more up close and up front in some of the images in our database, clicking and dragging is going to be the preferred method. So holding shift and then dragging in the direction of the annotation for creating polygons. Continuing along the dam, I continue to click to create nodes and just use my best judgment in defining the extents of the dam with the somewhat fuzzy boundaries that I see. As I approach the end of the dam, I'd like to call back to what I mentioned earlier. I mentioned earlier that I was going to save the rest of the reservoir until after I had finished the dam. The cut-ins that are seen through the dam of the reservoir, if I had chosen to build the dam around these cut-ins, then I would have to create a much more complex dam polygon than if I were to just create these as individual polygons labeled as a reservoir. I'll demonstrate this as I finish up the dam. Finishing up what I'd like to define as the extents of the dam itself. Later, I'll talk about why I'm cutting in here with the spillway. I go ahead and I close the dam and bring it to the front. At this point, it's a good point to mention that I should have been saving all along. Simply hitting Control-S will save your work. So with what I'd like to define as the extents of the dam finished, if I wanted to include one label for the reservoir and one label for the dam, and avoiding creating individual labels for these pieces of water body, what I'd have to do is as follows. I would have had to, and this is a good time to bring up a really nice tool for re-annotating polygons. If you want to do so, hold Shift, click on the node where you'd like to begin again, double click, and then from there, you can redo the original polygon. So to work on the dam again and define its extents as those of the entirety of the dam and the entirety of the reservoir is just the label behind it, I double-clicked here. Then I would have to define the extents of the dam as here. And for each of these individual panels that are parts of the dam. This creates a much more complex polygon where when I do want to define it, I have an issue where I need to be very, very, very close or to my own individual annotation of the dam that I was working on earlier. If I am not incredibly precise with the line that I had just created, then there will be a gap in the annotation of the dam, and this could pose issues with the computer trying to read the images that we are feeding into it. As a result, I choose not to do this. I'll hit escape now, hit escape again to return to my original image. The method that I was using there is a method that we had developed about a year ago to be more precise with our individual annotations, but simply adding more polygons on top ended up saving us more time in the long run. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and select reservoir and fill in these little blue spaces seen through the dam. And with each annotation, I'm clicking in and clicking in again to begin another reservoir polygon. Now I go back. I bring each of these to the front. As visually speaking, they do sit ahead of the dam. And at this point, I can define my spillway. So in defining the spillway on the backside of a dam, I look for where the water is passing through it. And within these 4 panels of the dam, I notice that the water passes at most underneath this almost white area of the dam. So I'll define this line across here as the border for my spillway. Working with that, I draw into the water body below and then define up to this line as I move across the rest of the dam. One thing that I should note is that as I move across, we'll notice these very dark areas where I just have to use my best judgment and determine where I think the spillway begins within the dam. As I finish up the right side, I move over to the left side of the dam and start with the spillway on this side. It's a little bit difficult to see where the spillway starts here, so again, I just use my best judgment. The water body that can be seen on the backside of the dam, I'd like to bring this up as I'm going ahead and finishing up the spillway itself. We will be defining as rapids. Rapids is a bit of a difficult label to categorize. In our data set, a big factor there was whether the water was whitewater. So if it could be clearly distinguished from the water on top of which it sat, then we would go ahead and define it as rapids. And within the waterfall, as well as the rapids data sets that build up Atlantis, you'll see a variety of rapids images where the distinction between rapids and the water body itself may at times be a bit blurred. With that being said, I finished up the spillway and now hit N, hit plus to bring to the front. And after creating a large polygon, at this point I'd like to save. It would be quite crushing to lose this polygon right now, so I'm going to go ahead and save in case of a crash on CVAT's part. I also noticed that 2 other spillway sections are present, so I need to go ahead and annotate those as well. And then afterwards, I could work on rapids. I bring these to the front again. And now, from what I can tell, the only label that concerns us at this point is rapids. I go ahead and select rapids, then zoom in on the areas where white water is visible and can be seen spewing off of what appears to be a water body that sits below it. Because of the more organic shape to rapids, I use the method that I mentioned earlier where I hold shift and then drag in the direction of the rapids. I do this along the entirety of the rapids water body, and because of the very detailed nature to this particular polygon, now poses a really good time to bring up a particular tool that's very helpful when working with, though I showed it earlier, when your computer starts to slow down as you're drawing a rather large polygon full of nodes. Go ahead and press N. This will close the polygon. At this point, you're going to want to go back to one of the final nodes within that individual polygon, hold shift, double click on the node, and you can restart the polygon. At this point, your computer will be lagging much less, as the number of nodes you're now creating is much lower than if you had continued with that original polygon. Continue to drag and direct your annotation. And when you finish up with your annotation, go ahead and click in again, closing this particular polygon. You may also notice that I didn't label the spillways themselves or particular sections of the spillways as white water or rapids. And this is because when it comes to the spillway, the rapids themselves, at least visually speaking, don't appear to really stand out. And with the importance of the spillway within the data set, it's prioritized over something such as rapids, at least in the setting of a dam. For particular subsets or sub-data sets within the overall Atlantis data set, we refer to the major label that we're focusing on as the target label. In this case, it would have been the dam. With the rapids polygon now finished, click on it, press plus again. I cannot emphasize how important this is. Control S to save. And at this point, our annotation of this image should be done. I drag our opacity, which is located in the bottom right, up to full. And now you can observe your work at this point. We see that each of our labels lines up correctly, spatially, and visually with what we expect. And in the top left corner, there's a black spot, and around the edge of the image itself, a thick black line that indicates that we did not annotate in these areas. Maybe if we had a black label, then this would be an annotation. But as we drag over these areas, we notice that nothing appears. However, if we drag over terrain, or even sky, we can see what sits behind these individual polygons and see the label's name itself, such as terrain, such as reservoir, such as dam, such as rapids. We drag over here, we notice that nothing's here. Therefore, there's no content for the computer to read when it eventually does read these annotated images. And there is no annotation, no polygon, no labeling that is occurring in that area, which is exactly what we want, as it is very difficult to define what exactly this area is in our image. At this point, we have finished this particular image, and I hit Control S again, just because I have had CVAT crash on me before. In fact, it's crashed on me many times. That concludes my walkthrough, or step-by-step walkthrough of this particular image. And before you go, I'd like to at least share another image that I've annotated where I can really stress how important it is to hit plus as you continue to label your particular image. And that would be this one. This is a much more complex image than what was visible in the previous image, and contains many more individual polygons. If I had messed up at any point and chosen not to hit plus, then there could be an error in the arrangement of the individual polygons, which then contributes to an inconsistency or an error in the computer reading the images themselves, which is something that we wish very much to avoid.